Hey, Phantom fans, you're watching Chronicle Chamber. My name is Scott, and today we're talking Phantom 2040: A New Shadow, Episode 5, Stolen Legacy. So, if you've been following the series, there were 20 episodes announced. They're coming out, weekly-ish. Um, Episode 5 brings us a quarter of the way through the story. So this is I don't know if the next episode will further tie it together, but essentially the end of this episode brings us back to the beginning of episode 1. We saw this big chase scene leading us into the series. Our hero, Carlos Oserio, has the Phantom suit. He's running, he runs into the Phantom, he's being chased by robots. That's kind of catching you up to speed. After that, we had a flashback kind of developing who he is, who Mel is, who's Charles Tyrus is, which is the series villain, a big tech magnet. This episode really kind of brings all that together and brings it back to where we started. So, there's a lot going on here. There's some stuff for old fans. There's some for new fans. A reintroduction of the Phantom character for some reason in episode 5, but for the new fans who maybe started reading Phantom 2040 and don't really know much about the Phantom, I could see it serving that purpose. But it's a lot of what we've seen already. The art is good. I really like the art by John Amore. The story by Alex Segura and Michael Moresi. Like it's still developing. It's still a little slow, and we get a lot of telling more so than showing. But now that we're past that first quarter, maybe since we're back to the action, we'll see more of that. As this develops, we'll see how it goes. But to jump right in, this episode starts off right where we left off at the end of last episode. Charles Tyrus is on stage. He has the Phantom suit. This is his big unveiling. He's promised. And so, he really just dives into talking about the Phantom legacy and how, this is something that's been lost, for a long time. So apparently, the events of Phantom 2040 and whenever this takes place, there's a huge gap when the Phantom disappeared. And we know that too because in a previous episode, Carlos Oserio talked about how he used to read Phantom comics as a kid. The Phantom was a hero who is no longer around. Um, we get a good look at the Phantom suit. Charles Tyrus, our tech magnet, is saying he's going to change that right now. And we get a lot of weirdly enough, this episode is just, outside of the flashbacks that we'll get to shortly, it's a lot of just glory shots of this Phantom suit, which, I'm here for it. I like it. Looks nice. Like seeing the purple, especially with the neon blue and teal and aqua that John Amore really likes to play with in this series. But here's Charles Tyrus, talking about his goal. He wants to bring the Phantom back. And we go into this, you know, telling of the Phantom story. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird because if you're a Phantom fan, this is probably a big no-no that, Charles Tyrus, our bad guy, finds a Phantom suit. He's giving a big speech in front of a whole bunch of media and people, and he's like, "Hey, let me tell you the Phantom's deal." He talks about how, Christopher Walker first stumbled into the Skull Cave. We get a nice shot of that here. Clearly this is inspired from classic designs, going back all the way to the earliest newspaper strip stories. For some reason, unknown to us readers, Charles Tyrus knows all about Christopher Walker. Um, and then, he goes into the oath, which, this image is kind of a homage or pastiche of a lot of classic images that talk about the oath. But, one you can probably point to is the Cy Berry oath panel that has this, side look with the skull. That seems to be a dead ringer for where this is inspired from. It's kind of cool that John Moore, for this panel and some of the ones we're going to see later, really leaned into some classic, you know, visuals that people who are Phantom fans can, point to and recognize. It's like that Leonardo DiCaprio scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, pointing at the screen and whistling, go, "Hey." Um, we go more into, Phantom finding himself the incarnation of the character. Something that's been missing from this series a lot is the stripes, and we get a nice shot of the stripes here with the holsters and the belt. I do like seeing that. The new suit does not have this. Um, you know, Charles Tyrus talks about how the Phantom legacy passed down from, generation to generation. And it's another thing where, as a reader, you're like, well, why does he know this? But one thing I want to point to in this panel, I really like this panel because I like the lighting here. This like half shadow across his face. He looks sinister, but it kind of fits with the neon lighting we've gotten in this series so far. So this is a cool panel. I really like it. Um, of course, we get the classic, Phantom, sitting like this. This is something you can harken back to the movie poster. It's been done several times, across different publishers. There are images like this that pop around, like Dynamite Entertainment comes to mind. Of course, Fru, which is, one of the leading publishers of Phantom Comics, if not the leading publisher. Um, here's a nice close up of the mask, though I'm less keen on this one because I feel like we saw this panel last episode. And then we get into, the another classic image from the test, right here. And, here's Carlos, and Mel, his friend. They're both listening to this. Carlos, it's kind of hard to read his face here. He looks sleepy, but also he could be skeptical. As, and this is as Charles Tyrus is still waxing poetic. We get a cool shot of the Phantom against the pirate ship here. And, in this panel right here, this is a dead ringer for the Phantom through issue 29 or 1090. Sorry, excuse me. Phantom Vandal Looters cover here. And then this one right after, fans might recognize from through issue 1994. Of course, it's in John Moore's style, but it's very much, paying tribute and homage to these classic covers, the Castle of Evil cover here. There's a few different covers you can point to for this one. The Phantom, with the backdrop of the American flag. Don Newton comes to mind, one of his covers, but there, of course, are others that we can point to that have a similar visions. And here, this is where it gets interesting to me because you can look at this, as Charles Tyrus is saying one generation to another. You can look at this and say, oh, this must be Julie Walker, right? Or you could say, maybe this is supposed to be Jetta because there's no name really attributed to this. It could go either way because we're talking about generations. So, you know, Jetta, being the daughter, we just had a Defenders of the Earth reboot comic where she was next in line. And we know Comics Kingdom and Mad Cave Studios, they do, if you read their Flash Gordon comics, the Comics Kingdom Flash Gordon strips appear in the back of the Flash Gordon comics that Mad Cave's putting out. So there is this hand-in-hand relationship between the two publishers. And that, very well could be the case for the Phantom here. And so like this gave me pause because I have a theory, and we'll get to this in a second. And he's talking about generations, and he's bringing it home, talking about why everybody's here and why he's, making everybody listen to this and that his corporation is going to do something great, that he built from the ground up. Carlos is getting mad, as he's listening to this, he's got his arms crossed. He says it's the money you inherited. You didn't build this up, and Mel, who has been egging Carlos on this whole time to stand up for himself, is now telling him to like, shut up, hush, keep it quiet. Um, and they bicker a little bit. She just mentioned she hasn't seen, you know, him this fired up in forever. It's interesting because it looks like this panel is the exact same panel from earlier, just with different dialogue bubbles put over it. But then we get to, the moment we've been waiting for, and this is subtle. Like this is kind of a panel you would skip past because it's just someone's mouth and teeth. But I actually like this because it makes focus in on the words. As you're reading it, it kind of emphasizes the words that are coming out of Tyrus's mouth. So you pause here a little bit. It's almost like that pause you would hear in a movie before someone drops a bombshell. And it also slows things down. We see Carlos clenching a fist. He's saying none of this is right. And, Tyrus is going to present, the Phantom for everybody. This is his goal seems to be to don this outfit and become the new Phantom. And right as he's about to talk about his role in this, that, used to be a worthy successor, but, now he's going to be the one. Um, Carlos, as we could see by these couple little shots here, I like this close up on the eyes because something's happening. We can't see it yet. It's making us anticipate it. And then there goes Carlos running off with a suit. Cool shot. Um, this is Charles Tyrus whining that this is his moment, calling for the guards. And we see in the background here, on the over his shoulders, both sides, there are robots in the back, and those are the robots we see in episode one. And this is him demanding his suit, and this clearly is a reference to Spider-Man No More. That's why you have the trash cans like this with the suit hanging or the clothes hanging out here. If you were looking at the Spider-Man No More art, you would see the Spidey suit hanging there. So it's kind of a fun little nod to a different character. But here's where my theory comes in. So, Charles Tyrus is talking about um, legacy and how it goes from one successor to another, and there's this whole generational thing. He gives us the whole story of the Phantom, right? And for newcomers to this series, it's a good crash course on like who the Phantom is, like rough cuts. For fans, you're like, well, wait, why does this guy know everything about the Phantom? Why does he know about Christopher Walker? Why doesn't he know about the lineage and how this worked? That makes no sense. And even worse, why is he telling everybody about it? You know, and to answer this, the creative team could have easily created a sequence where Charles Tyrus finds the Chronicles or something, and he reads it and and understands everything there is to know about the Phantom. Like you can make that argument. It's still not great, but you can draw that illusion. But another theory, and this goes back to the whole Defenders of the Earth thing that I mentioned with what could be either Julie Walker or it could be Heloise as well. That's not out of the realm of possibility. That's Heloise was in the Phantom 2040 cartoon. It could also be Jeddah, and maybe, a theory here, just throwing this out. What if Charles Tyrus is, you know, same bloodline, different relative? And this goes back to, I say Defenders of the Earth because we have Kurt Walker, who is, the evil brother, if you want to call him that, of Kit in that series, who is, their rivals in the most recent comic series. Kurt Walker donned the Phantom suit. So this could be more of that. It could be Charles Tyrus knows all this stuff because he's related, and that might be the big surprise that comes in later. Or it could just be a guy who wants to play hero. It could go either way, but I wanted to float those two ideas out there just because it's something to think about. We don't know where this is going to land. Um, but it's intriguing to propel us forward. Now, as a story, how is this faring? It goes back to, I like I said earlier, I like the art. I think the art is strong. It's great to, scroll through. I love the format. Yet again, in this episode, we get all the telling but not showing. We get a little bit of action at the end, but we've had like 3 episodes where it's mostly just people talking about this big announcement, talking about something that's going to happen. We get some, interaction between Mel and Carlos, which is great. We know their relationship, we know their closeness. That's cool. But with Charles Tyrus, it's just everybody talking about him, and then he gives his big speech, and we haven't seen him do anything nefarious or evil, which we need to really seal the deal. Like, we know he's a bad guy. I'm not over here saying have sympathy for Charles Tyrus. No, this dude, clearly is, someone who exploits other people. That has been established. I just want to see it. I want to show it. I want some kind of tension with it, to see this bad guy, before my own eyes so he can get his comeuppance later. And that's really what I think is missing is there's so much, exposition and backdrop to build in these first 5 episodes that we kind of lose the pacing and momentum of most Phantom stories that you would find in newspaper strips. If you read any of those stories, those things read, like your classic adventure in a lot of cases. There are some that are more drama, and less action oriented, but a lot of the favorites that people, always point to, it is a beat for beat, action adventure. And that I feel is the one aspect that is missing from this series thus far. That being said, I'm still on board. I'm excited to see what episode 6 brings because we have now closed that loop on the first episode and all these flashbacks. So now we're up to speed. Now we can see Carlos and Kit Walker Jr. interact, and we can see where that goes from here. So, if you're on board with me, let me know. If you totally disagree, let us know in the comments. I also want to shout out my uh, colleague, Jermaine, at Chronicle Chamber, for helping, point out and ferret out a lot of these references. He deserves credit. He's a site editor. He is one of the, masterminds behind Chronicle Chamber. If you are looking for more fandom reviews, news, etc. Our podcast, Expand the Phantom Podcast. You can check out chroniclechamber.com or look up Chronicle Chamber on YouTube. If you want to hear more from me personally, you can find me at scottweldonwrites.com or find me at Writer Scott on Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky. Um, and in the words of our main characters in the Phantom 2040 cartoon, until next time, scan you later.